Welcome to episode 137 of the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show that's dedicated to changing the way that the military-affiliated population thinks and talks about veteran mental health. On today's show, I have a conversation with combat veteran and best-selling author Karl Marlantes. His book, Matterhorn, was described by Sebastian Junger as one of the most profound and devastating novels ever to come out of Vietnam or any war. His companion book, What It Is Like to Go to War, is his personal look at what war experience is like.
I think just for therapists out there that you are no less effective because you don't understand, quote unquote, what it's like to be in combat. Nobody understands what it's like to be in combat except the one guy who's talking to you. I mean, those people who've been there understand it, but that's very, very few people. What they're looking for is someone to listen to them, someone who's safe to talk to, someone who reaches them as an individual. That has nothing to do with combat. I mean, what therapists give to everybody, but certainly to veterans, is that ability to just sort of unburden your soul, and then have somebody who doesn't have your particular, peccadillos and irrationalities point out paths to you that you might not have thought of, and or maybe your thinking's just a little confused on this issue, and that doesn't take any understanding of combat. It goes two ways. I mean, combat veterans, and believe me, I'm one of them, have a kind of a disdain for people that haven't been there. That gets in your way too. I mean, if you want to rejoin society, you got to get off of that high horse.
Welcome to the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes around veteran mental health. My name is Duane, and I'm a retired Army non-commissioned officer and a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After retiring from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, then you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, however, it was just a useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing's not set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support service members, veterans, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast once again, and as always, we really appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn more about veteran mental health. We've had a number of guests on the show who are veterans themselves talking about their own mental health journey and talking about how things have changed in their post-military life. And that's definitely my guest today, who may not need much of an introduction, but still more people might not know as vocal he is about veteran mental health and family mental health and things like that. So my guest today is best-selling author Karl Marlantes. Karl, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. I definitely appreciate. I reached out. I actually had Dr. Larry Decker on the show back in episode 99, and he suggested that we get together and talk because, as I mentioned, you're a very outspoken advocate for mental health, wellness, therapy, and things like that, and definitely like to get into that, but give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Oh, yeah. First of all, I want to say Larry Decker was my VA therapist, and he pulled me out of a real hole. So I have nothing but great admiration for him. Yeah, I mean, I was a Marine. I grew up in a little logging town in Oregon, and all the guys on the football team went someplace called San Diego and came back with suntans, which we never saw, and were about 4 inches wider in the shoulders and swaggered up and down Main Street of town. And like most 18-year-olds, I said, well, I want some of that, And then there was patriotism. There was a draft. All of those factors. I joined the Marine Corps about a year after I left high school. And I got into a program the Marines had called Platoon Leaders Class, where you go through boot camp in the summers, and then you don't get paid or anything, but you don't have to march around with ROTC or NROTC and get a commission upon graduation. And I ended up being a platoon commander, infantry platoon commander in Vietnam, and served at one tour there, and came back, finished up at the Pentagon, and then went back to college.
And so, and that was, you definitely here we're talking about, so when were you in Vietnam?
I was there in 68 and 69. I served right where the Laotian border meets the then demilitarized zone. We were way up in the mountains, probably 4,000 foot. And it was cold up there. I mean, that was one thing I never expected, was to be freezing in Vietnam. But when you get wet and it's about 40, you get cold, 45 degrees. We suffered with hypothermia, which is like, whoa, how is that possible?
In the jungle, yeah.
Yeah, but we were high. And and I never saw a friendly village. I never saw a friendly Vietnamese. I mean, it was in many ways, I was very grateful, because we had the Marines I was with the 4th Marine Regiment, and we fought the 320th Steel Division, which was a very fine North Vietnamese Army unit, but it was straight, World War II Marines against North Vietnamese infantry regulars. And I didn't have any moral dilemmas like, is the little girl coming toward us with the basket, does she have a hand grenade in it or an apple? I was grateful. We had more casualties up there, but way less of that moral trauma that is so difficult in the wars we're fighting today.
And that is, that's an important distinction, right? Not that there was not moral decisions that were made and the challenges that you might have had, but, the rules were much clearer, right? You're on a two-way firing range, and didn't have the ambiguity of maybe urban combat and civilian casualties and rules of engagement and things like that.
Totally. I mean, it was absolutely, if you could identify it as someone that wasn't your side, you could shoot. And in many ways, one of the things I get on my political high horse about is that if you can't send a military organization into an environment where they can't act like a military organization, then maybe you ought to be thinking about sending in the State Department or the police force or something like that. We've been misusing our warriors who, they're young, they're 19, right? I mean, putting them in these moral dilemmas where they're trying to figure out whether to pull the trigger or not. And then with the fear of getting court-martialed if they make a mistake, I'm just going like, you've got the wrong people there. That's where I come down really strongly. It's politics, but that's where I've been. And because of my experience in Vietnam and talking to vets coming back from places like Iraq, Afghanistan, where, they're always in a quandary. Why? Why do we put them in that situation?
That's entirely accurate, especially as you're talking about the age. My father was a Vietnam veteran. 67, 68 was when he was there, and three of his brothers, two brothers and a brother-in-law, were there between 68, 69, and 70. And so one time my father and I were having a conversation, and something about the differences between when I deployed to Iraq for the first time, because I had been in the Army since 92. And of course, the first half of my career was peacetime Army. Mm-hmm. And my father had said, for him, he went to war with an 18-year-old brain, where I went to war with a 32-year-old brain. And there was a difference.
Oh, yes. And you want your 32, 35, 40-year-old brains in your special forces organization. And you want them in these incredibly difficult, ambiguous situations. But your 19-year-olds, those are the ones you say, take the hill. And whoa, that's who you want. I don't want a 40-year-old in my platoon. If I have to be in that kind of combat, they're going to be saying, "Wait a second, Lieutenant, where's the Air Force?" But so again, it's that thing about putting the right people at the right age and at the right place. And I don't think we do a lot of thinking about that.
No, you're entirely right. And I think back to, as I was a platoon sergeant in Afghanistan, at that point, I wasn't serving with the special forces yet. And it was only myself and one of my squad leaders, had been in the Army before 9/11. Of course, my platoon leader, and I had a platoon of, 65, 70 troops, and, all of them were, 30 and below. My senior guys were just getting into being 30 years old. And so, and it is, war is a young man's game. And then you as a young man, come back to the U.S. and are still a young man, but you're a young man who has seen the jungles of Vietnam, the mountains of Vietnam, and combat. And of course, we've heard a lot. I heard a lot about it from my father. I actually first remember, in the mid 80s, visiting the Traveling Wall, and my father and my uncle having really the first time that they had a welcome home. But I'd like to hear, from your standpoint, what it was like for you to return from Vietnam.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'm still mad about it.
Sure.
I am. First of all, as a culture, we still have a very low understanding of what it's like to try and reintegrate people back into the community. Our, quote, more primitive, end quote, cultures were way more adept at that. We lost that ritual, the community welcoming sort of forms that, sweat lodges, dances, all these things that we lost. When I came back, I was on an airplane with a bunch of Marines. I still had a year of service to do because I had a 3-year commitment because I was an officer. Literally, we landed at El Toro Marine Base and Southern California, and got off the plane, and there were card tables all down the runway, and the guys lined up and went from card table to card table. And the last card table, they asked the kid if he wanted to have an air ticket to his home of record or the cash. And they were out of the Marine Corps. 2 days out of the jungle. And I mean, they all took the cash and went to the bars in San Diego. And as I tell people, I said half of them are probably still there. But it was a terrible understanding of how to reintegrate people back in. And then we were told not to wear our uniforms. We could only travel at 2 a.m. because civilians were getting upset because the military was in the airports. And, I had people throw things at me, and a lot of my friends did, like they'd be hitchhiking and a car had stopped. One of my friends' car stopped and the kids got out and started throwing beer cans at him. And this is our welcome home. I wrote about it and what it's like. I actually did get spit on by a woman in a train, but I don't think that was that common. But it became a metaphor. It became a metaphor for how we were treated. And I think that coming home probably traumatized me as much as the war experience. I mean, it's hard to say it's hard to compare traumas, but I expected to sort of come home and have people love me and be happy about me coming home. And sure, my mom and dad were, but no one else came to the airport. I mean, it was really something to come back to that kind of, not just indifference. I think a lot of the current veterans face indifference, or they face this false heroism thing, which I think embarrasses most of us. It's, oh, wow, you're our brave warrior. I mean, listen, everybody knows 90% of the military are people that do support services. Very, very vital, absolutely necessary, but they're not out there, being the infantry. And anyway, coming back to that kind of being blamed for the foreign policy of the United States when you're, 18 to 22 years old, and it really was unfair. In many ways, we just hid. I mean, I grew my hair long and I went back to college, and I would never tell anybody I was in the war because it would just be like, I don't know, pardon my language, laying a turd on the dinner table. I mean, it was just, you couldn't do it. And my favorite story of that is that I had we had really close friends, that my first wife, and had been in college with this other woman. And so they knew each other from college. And we were both married couple, and our kids about the same age. And Barry was the man's name. He and I coached the soccer team together, and we'd pick the kids up after school. We'd switch off. We'd have overnights. And after about 6 or 8 years, the wives were talking and found out that Barry and I were both Marines in Vietnam. Isn't that interesting? I mean, that's how underground the Vietnam veterans went, because of that horrible reception. Now, the country has learned from that. And I've had many, many people come up to me and say, I don't know what was going on. Why did we behave that way, non-veterans? We went kind of cuckoo, and the country did. And it was just casting their darkness onto these young kids. I would never shoot anybody. I would never kill anybody. I would never do any of those horrible things. Yeah, well, I think you would. But you want to kid yourself. So then what you say, well, you would do that. You did that. And that's just the way humans are. And we're better now. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Like I said, you're either facing indifference or you're facing, I think, almost I don't know what the word is, treating people like heroes when it's kind of embarrassing.
No, you're exactly right. And in the idea of the homecoming being more traumatic than sometimes the actual combat. And as a clinical mental health professional, as a therapist now, I am working with Vietnam veterans, and here we are, 50 years down the line. And that is a theme that I am hearing from the veterans that I'm working with. So to speak, we dealt with the Vietnam stuff, but whether or not they actually dealt with how they had to come back, and exactly what you're talking about, was they just went underground and they blended back into, so they didn't start to emerge again until, the mid 80s. And that's 15, almost 20 years after, the trauma, so to speak. And if we're needing to deal with these issues, in the immediate aftermath, this is 15, 20 years that, Vietnam has been lingering, but also, and I think Dr. Ed Tick talked about, it's a national moral injury of how veterans were treated when they came back. And then you talk about now, and this is something that I often draw the parallels from my standpoint as a combat veteran. A lot of the veterans I work with is, yes, there is that hero worship piece, right? We're treated like, the next greatest generation, and, there's parades and stuff like that. But there's also a sense of, as you said, indifference and, who really cares, and just sort of being ignored, a lot like Korean War veterans. And then there's an undercurrent, especially with veterans that are trying to go back to the workforce, that still get a little bit of that resentment. Like, we love veterans from afar if they're in the movie theaters or Memorial Day or Veterans Day, or They're up at the front of the plane. But when I actually have a veteran sitting next to me, there's something a little different about that. And there's still a little bit of hesitation. And so it's sort of, the veterans today get a mix of all three of those.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that I get a lot of, I don't know what, for better word, civilians, people that were not in the military, which is, of course, the vast majority of people. They're a little afraid to approach veterans. And they don't want to sort of set him off, he's going to go postal. There's this sort of mythology about veterans being on hair triggers, and there's a bit of truth to that, but basically, nobody's going to explode or go crazy on you. They may feel uncomfortable. Well, what do I do? How do I approach a veteran? I said, the first thing you do is you stop treating them as a class and start treating them as individuals. See, it's like, oh, veterans. That's there's no personal connection there. Like, thank you for your service. Why is that so hollow? Because you're not actually thanking that person for anything. You're just doing a general sort of like, oh, we're thanking veterans for their service. I say to people, you got to have a little courage. But if you got the kid in the airport, don't just say thank you for your service. Sit down next to him and say, where were you? What unit were you in? Which service were you in? What did you eat for breakfast? There are these questions that you can ask a veteran that indicates that you're actually interested in them as a person. And believe me, the veterans, most of them will respond. And yes, you got to accept that sometimes the veterans, I don't want to talk about it, get out of my face. Okay. And if it's somebody you know and love, you just got to go back at them and just gird up. But you just have to learn how to sort of ease in. because veterans don't know who you are. They're even if they've known you all their lives, they don't know how you're going to react. I mean, we do horrible things. I mean, we not just kill people, but I mean, I've right in my book. I mean, I once was involved in just not taking any prisoners because we just lost our temper, and it's hard to explain to somebody. Well, I lost my temper. What? And then you wouldn't take prisoners because of that? You're horrible. Well, you had to be there, that kind of. And so you have to feel safe. Well, how do you get that way? How do you get the veteran to feel safe? Well, you start talking to them as a person, and they start telling you about what they had for breakfast and how hot it was, and what they missed about home. And then pretty soon, after a while, they'll be talking about the war. I mean, I think most of us want to talk about it. We want to get back into the community. We want to be part of it again. Like you say, you don't want to when you go to work or try to get a job. Suddenly, it's no longer thank you for your service. It's like, oh, you're different than I am. Whoa. It didn't used to be that way because, well, when we went to war, when we were all wearing moccasins, it was the hunters that went to war, and so the rest of the people didn't have any protein. So everybody went to war. I mean, it was really different, but it's not the way it is today. And my analogy for that, which I think is also at the root of this problem of reintegration, is this unconscious attitude, and it is unconscious on the part of the non-veterans. It's this: we have this rifle, okay, and a rifle is made by scientists who have been trained by second-grade school teachers to teach them their arithmetic, and it's been financed by bankers, and the bankers have been fed by farmers who've grown crops, and everybody pays taxes that buys this weapon. So there's this huge interrelated chain that builds this weapon. And at the end of this very long chain, some 19-year-old pulls the trigger. And then we say, he did the killing. No, we did the killing. But people don't want to accept that. He did the killing. And until the country begins to take responsibility for the fact that kid didn't have that weapon without all these other people doing their part, including voting for the people that voted to go to war. Well, here's another political statement: or failed to vote to go to war, our Congress's dereliction of duty. Until that unconscious attitude is changed, you're going to have problems with everybody reintegrating, because he didn't just do the killing. Yeah, he did part of the killing, and so did you.
That's an interesting concept. As I'm hearing you, I'm thinking of Dave Grossman and his books on killing and on war, and how the distance between the individual doing the killing, quote unquote, and the actual killing that's being done, the farther back you get, the less of an impact it has. And the example that he uses is, the individual who conducts hand-to-hand combat, of course, has the full experience. But the person launching Tomahawk missiles off of the ship in the Gulf, it's almost, academic to them in many ways.
Right. It's like they pushed the button and went to lunch.
Right. And then but you're talking about, and not even farther back than that, right? Farther back than the guy who's pushing the button, but the one who made the button, and the shipbuilder.
Exactly. And the one who paid their taxes. I mean, nobody's clean here. All right. Nobody's clean. And that's what we don't understand.
And so I think there definitely is this othering of veterans. As you said, it's, stop treating us like a class, because we wouldn't say, what is it like to grow up in the South Side of Chicago, right? Because not to treat that individual as a separate class. And, I'm from St. Louis, East St. Louis. Actually, I just read there was a tragic, a great young kid that was, a football prospects as an 8th grader, tragically died in East St. Louis, right? So there's challenges, on the home front, but we don't treat people on the home front as this separate class.
No.
But then you talk about, this idea of just talk to a veteran. This was actually, it was on another show that a friend of mine asked this question. He was a non-veteran. Actually, he's an immigrant. He was Canadian and naturalized citizen. And he said, well, what do we say if we don't say thank you for your service? And I say, listen to the story. And that's what you're talking about, is there's this paradox of the veteran story. We want to be able to tell what happened to us, and we don't know how to do it. And in many ways, you almost can't pull it out of us. But I get the sense that that's where Matterhorn came from. And I heard one time that, this is a book, of course it took you 30 years to write it, but it wasn't a book that would have been published in the 80s or maybe even the 90s, that it was a book whose time finally came to look back at Vietnam in the early 2000s and so on.
Yeah. No, that's right. I wrote that Matterhorn, the first draft of Matterhorn was done in the 70s, and no one would touch it. I couldn't get a single person to even read it. I'd get letters from agents or publishers in New York saying, oh, yeah, we lost that war. No one wants to hear about it. We couldn't sell this book to save our souls. And it took 35 years before it got published. And I think a lot of it was because what we were involved with in Afghanistan in particular, but Iraq looked pretty seriously close to it. It was eerily similar. I mean, rules of engagement, they could run across the border. We couldn't shoot them. We were supporting corrupt government. No one understood what was going on. The rest of the country didn't care. The Taliban wasn't, storming the beaches of Santa Monica. I mean, it's pretty hard to tell a 19-year-old he's defending his family when his family's out shopping. So all of that was eerily similar to the Vietnam situation. Vietnam was the first attempt at, quote, nation building, end quote. And because of that, I think that Matterhorn finally, its time came. And also this idea of telling your story. I've told this story before, but since it's true, I have to tell it again. But I was still in the Marine Corps, and I was at the headquarters Marine Corps. I was actually stationed at the Pentagon, and I had to carry some, classified material over to the White House. And so I'm in my full uniform, and I'd been back maybe 3 or 4 months, and I'm walking down, right next to the White House, and a bunch of students are on the other side of the street from me, and they're chanting slogans, and they're waving North Vietnamese flags and Viet Cong flags, and they're calling me names, giving me the finger, shouting bad things at me. I'm in my uniform on one side of the street, they're all on the other side of the street, and are calling my friends baby killers, and all the guys I served with were like 18 and 19. The average age in my platoon was 18 and 10 months. So they were babies compared to those college students. And I had this horrible feeling. I wasn't angry. I was sad. I knew if I stepped off the sidewalk to go even talk to these people, it would be, in the newspapers, Marine attack students, I just couldn't do anything, and no one was helping me. All the civilians were walking by with their heads down. I couldn't talk to them. And I just said, you don't know who we are. You have no idea who you're talking about. You just see somebody in a uniform. You don't know who we are. And I wanted to somehow tell our story. What is it like to be 18 and 19 and trying to grow up in a war over in some place called Vietnam? And so Matterhorn was about trying to tell our story. And that's really what it is. It's about a bunch of kids in the jungle is what it's about.
See, and that's and as you bring that out, it brings to mind is, in order to tell a story, there's at least two people in that exchange, the one that's actually telling the story and then the audience that's receiving it. And that's even more frustration when you want to tell the story, you have the ability to tell the story, but yet there is no audience for it. It might make you feel like the story that you have isn't worth telling.
Well, yeah. There were many times that because I got, 100 rejection letters. It was, and I would literally sometimes go down to a bookstore, in the nighttime and look at books and pull them off the shelf and say, I can write as well as these guys. Why can't I get published? Am I crazy? Am I crazy to keep trying to do this? Because you really are crazy, as they say, if you keep doing the same thing with the same bad result. It's time to change. But I was pretty stubborn, and so I didn't.
That's the Marine in you, perhaps.
Yeah, I know. That's right. Yeah.
And so as this was going on in the 70s with the first draft of Matterhorn, and as you're shopping it around for 30 years, you also emerge into actually getting into therapy and start addressing some of these issues. You've been very vocal about that. Perhaps at this point, not only is Matterhorn giving an opportunity to look at maybe the wars of today through the lens of the past, but also giving you an opportunity to be vocal about your opinions about therapy and counseling and the benefit to combat veterans especially, but anybody.
Totally. I love to tell the story of how I got into it. I had never heard of post-traumatic stress, never heard of it. I mean, I'm a fairly educated guy, but just wasn't part of the zeitgeist in the 80s and even the 90s. And I was doing some really weird behavior. I bumped my head against the cabinets in the kitchen, and I took the cabinets out with my fists, which, shattered the dishes. They were on the floor. You think the family doesn't get scared? Yeah. I mean, I'd be up in the middle of the night. There'd be a noise. I'd be out on the street, stark ass naked, before I'd come to my senses. What are you doing out here, Marlantes? This is really weird. And so my first wife, who she and I are great friends now, we didn't know what hit us. That was what the problem was. No education. She saw something for a free counseling session at the local school in the cafeteria, a bunch of local counselors, looking for work probably, for job stress. And she said, "You're under a lot of job stress. I mean, you're really behaving weird." And I guess so. So I went down there, and I'm sitting there, a bunch of people in the school cafeteria, and finally my turn comes up, and I sit down at the table with this guy, and he starts asking me some questions, and I start telling him about some of these weird behaviors that I just mentioned to you, and he looks at me and he says, "Were you ever in a war?" And when he said that, I burst into tears. I didn't know what hit me. I mean, I'm talking about snot running out of my nose, bawling. I mean, everybody in that school cafeteria was looking at me because I was just bawling out loud. I mean, out of control for 10 minutes. Finally, I start to get back to, and he looks at me and he writes on the back of a card. He says, and this is where he says, Larry Decker. And he says, here's where he is. He was at a Veterans Outreach Center in Santa Barbara. He said, "I'm going to call him on the phone, and you're going to go see him now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not this afternoon. I'm calling him now, and you're walking down to see him, and you better show up. You have something called post-traumatic stress disorder. Have you ever heard of it? No. Well, you got it." and so I'm stumbling down the street literally with this card in my hand. I walk into the vet center, and Larry had a client right at that time, and he came out and he said, "I'll see you in about 20 minutes." And that started me on therapy, and it basically turned my life around because I was a complete wreck.
And this was the 80s, late 80s, 90s?
No, it was the 90s.
90s, right? 25 years after, Vietnam. And just that question is, were you ever? Triggered that. And that's a long time to carry around this burden. And I'm starting to see some veterans. I'm seeing many veterans, post 9/11 veterans now. But then there may still be some veterans. Number one, we're about 20 years away, from the first traumatic events of Afghanistan, really.
Yes.
And so, this message of, don't wait 25 years. To get in to see somebody to deal with this stuff because war was a part of your life.
Yeah. Well, I advocate, and I really believe this, that the Navy and Army Medical Corps ought to beef up its psychiatrists or psychologists. And we need to make counseling mandatory because, as you well know, there's a stigma. It's like, oh, he's got trouble with the war, or he's shaky, flaky, shaky, all those words. But if you have to go, it's like it's time for your checkup. It's like, well, you have your annual checkup, right? Well, you have your 6-month checkup with the shrink. The Israeli army it has the battalion surgeon and the battalion psychiatrist. And if you're feeling like, you got the flu, well, then you go to the surgeon. If you're feeling like, bad because your girlfriend just dumped you, then you go see the psychologist. It's really different. And if everybody had to do it, I think we'd catch a lot of this stuff early. Now, I don't think it's the military's job to cure us from post-traumatic stress because those people have a very different job. They're like the trainers on a professional football team. They're going to pump you full of, cortisol and get you, or whatever it is, cortisol, and get you back on the field. That's their job, to get you stable and back on the field. But still, they would start to catch this stuff. And when you get out of the military, that's when you have to start trying to heal it and change it. And, you can do a lot of it in the military, but I think the burden still has to be on the civilian side. Veterans Administration, local, state veteran, Departments of Veterans Affairs, churches, there's a lot of places that this can take place. So I don't want to lay it on the military. I had this wonderful experience. I was at Quantico and talking about stuff like this, and to the staff at the basic school. And this colonel comes up to me afterwards, and he's just classic Marine colonel, high and tight, built like a tank, and he's sputtering. He's literally sputtering. He says, we've got 6 programs to deal with all this stuff you're talking about. And he says, I don't know if it's working or not. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a Marine. And I just went, yeah, this is the wrong guy, So we got to, again, it's way back at the policy level. Are you sending the right kind of person for the right kind of job? Why are you assigning Marines to become, psychiatrists? I mean, sorry, these are not the guys you want, So it goes back to the politicians, ultimately, the leadership of the country. That's where we have to make these policy decisions right to get the rest of it right. So everybody wants to focus on the tail end. I keep saying you got to focus on the front end.
No, you're entirely accurate, and it's definitely, and perhaps things have changed, or I have seen things change, and even since I was in, and they started pushing, behavioral health specialists down to the unit level, the battalion and brigade level, and still there is this, the old man can stand up in front and say, hey, go see Doc all day long, but if you're sitting next to that squad leader that you spent the last 12 months in a foxhole with, and that guy saying you better not say nothing, and really getting it down to the individual level, but not requiring them to be the mental health professionals. I agree that's critical. The job of our military is to fight and win our nation's wars, but we can't do that effectively if we have this generational impact of, and you mentioned it before, not just traumatic stress reaction and things like that, but, all of it, the substance abuse and the depression, anxiety. And then when we get out of the military, this lack of purpose and meaning and what do I do with my life now that I'm no longer allowed to be what I wanted to be when I grew up? And so there is this need to reach back into the military and make some changes, because ultimately in the long run, it is a national defense issue, is a diminishing number of Americans are considering military service as an option, because the prevalent wisdom is, my son or daughter is going to come back damaged and deranged.
Yeah. I think there's something about that. And you're not going to have an effective professional military. If you have a professional military, that means that you go back for a 3rd or a 4th tour, unless you sort of got your feet on the ground. And you and I have both been around NCOs and officers who are flaky and they make bad decisions, and a lot of that is because of untreated post-traumatic stress while they're still in. I remember watching a video once of Norman Schwarzkopf go off. Just went off, right? And I looked at that and I said, that's a classic post-traumatic stress reaction. And of course, nobody thought about that during the Gulf War. That was early 90s. But that's what he was suffering from. And he was a combat veteran. And without this kind of psychological grounding, you're not an effective fighting force. Like I said, it's you got to balance it out. On the other hand, to just say that's up to the military, that's wrong. It's not just up to the military. After all, who sent them? Who's responsible for that?
Right. Well, there's the responsibility of a nation, right? You break it, you buy it.
Yeah. And getting back in. See, the thing is that you come back, if you go back to Fort whatever, you're still in your military family, and everybody talks about that. but you're not in the nation's family. You're not in the civilian family. See, and the military can't get you there. No matter how much therapy you do, well, as long as you're staying inside the military family, you're not going to get any help reintegrating into society. Let's face it, the military is very much separated from society. I mean, they have their own everything. PXs, their own way of being, their own language. I mean, there's a major difference between the way it was when you were drafting people. World War II, about, I don't know, 3/4 of the military were drafted. So it's a big difference.
No, you're exactly right. I recall, and I didn't know it then, right? And this is the hindsight being 2020. But when I was on Fort Carson, active duty, off post was where I went to sleep and maybe caught a movie once in a while, right? But
That's
all
right,
of the, all life happened. Our Walmart was a PX, our grocery store was the commissary, and everything happened there, but then you also talk about the difference with this professional military, and perhaps even while being drafted. And I've heard this from a number of Vietnam veterans as they were growing up and approaching the mid-60s. They deliberately did not get married. They deliberately didn't focus on building a family because they knew that they'd be drafted. But now, and whatever the statistics are, and I've heard a number of them, but a larger number of the military is married with families. As you and I were talking before this, I had 2 kids when I started to deploy, kept them all the way through. But I went, as a father, and a husband, and the impact on the family, if the military doesn't have a responsibility to support the mental health of the soldier or the Marine, they definitely have even less of a responsibility to support the mental health of the family. And yet that's just as critical as making sure we have an effective fighting force.
Absolutely. How many guys love the military but quit because they just can't handle the family and the military at the same time? It's one of the big problems. My wife just really hated it, and so I had to stop. I mean, I've heard that a lot. Well, you're a lot of talent going out the door,
Right. And so, and you said that this is actually a question that you've had pretty often is the psychological impact of combat and war, not on the individual who fought in it, but on the family members that maybe shared the life after or even shared the deployment with them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my there's two stories about my oldest daughter. I have 5 kids, 3 girls and 2 boys. And, one is my oldest daughter does not let me forget the fact that she went at one stretch in her life. She went to 12 schools in 8 years because I'm running around doing my crazy, post-traumatic stress, adrenaline stuff. Couldn't stay still long enough to leave her in school more than 3 or 4 months. And the other one, which is a little more humorous, but is absolutely true. She looked at me about 3 or 4 Christmases ago. We're having dinner, and she says, "Dad," and when one of your kids says "Dad" in that tone of voice, you go, "Oh, now what's coming?" She says, "I just have to say something. Nobody's shooting at you is not a good standard for a 4-year-old."
Don't cry over spilled milk.
That's right. I mean, stop whining. Nobody's shooting at you. I mean, that was my attitude, Well, it's not really good to apply that to 4 or 5-year-olds. I mean, they're not ready for it. But the kids learned to deal with me. I mean, they would actually take turns waking me up. I woke him up last time. It's not my turn. You wake him up, because I'd come out of bed, jumped. And but one of the things is that nobody understood that it was not that Dad wasn't crazy. I mean, that was the sort of the thing. Dad's crazy. I mean, as opposed to, well, Dad has troubles from the war. The war has made him react this way. It's not Dad's not crazy. He's okay, but we just have to understand why if you start. Here's a great one. My again, the same daughter. She's sort of more of a psychologist than the rest of us. She said, "Why was it that if I dropped the milk in front of you, if I dropped the milk one time, you would just be fine. You'd say, let's just clean it up and be absolutely calm. And if I dropped it another time, you would go through the roof, scream, jump, scream at me." And I went, "It's because if you dropped it in front of me, I was fine. If you dropped it behind me, it set me off because of I was right back into the combat situation and I wasn't thinking anymore. And if you could just tell the kids, Dad isn't crazy. If you scare him or startle him, that triggers something in his brain which has been changed because of combat, and this is the result. Don't do it. Or if you do it and he goes off, you can make a joke about it. It's not. Don't get so serious about it. Just understand it. And I mean, my second wife, who didn't go through that horrible post-traumatic stress stuff that my first wife and I went through. I still have it. I came back about 3 or 4 years ago and had a bunch of groceries in my hand, and my youngest daughter had put that little chain on the door that when you open the door, the chain stops it. Well, I came in and I shoved against the door because my hands were full with my shoulder, and the chain went bunk like that. That's all it took. I mean, the groceries are up in the air. I was on that door with my fist, wham, wham. I mean, whoa. And then my wife, Ann, sticks her head through the crack of the door and smiles at me, and she says, "Did you take your meds this morning?" And it just took away the shame. Because, I mean, when you go off like that, you do stupid stuff like that. I mean, I feel ashamed of myself. I mean, and not to mention that my hands are bruised and bleeding, really stupid stuff. But she just had this sense of humor about it. "You take your meds this morning. It wasn't my fault. It was just a startled reaction." No, maybe, I don't know. And I had to pick up the groceries and life went on. As opposed to, earlier, I mean, with people who are ignorant, I'm taking the kids and going to mother because, you're dangerous. I'm not dangerous. I'm just startled.
Yeah, and I think that's critical that the family understands that as you're talking, and this is a story that I've told before on the show, but it's very appropriate here is, I help take care of dinner on the weekends, and I think I was there cooking. My son was getting a glass out of the cabinet, and there was a cookie sheet or something on the, so a plastic cup fell out and hit the cookie sheet, and it was right. And right. And just hearing that, and you likely have, and I jumped across the kitchen, and my son's sitting there looking at me with a cup in his hand, like confused. And my wife's in the other room. She was like, "What happened?" And he's like, "Dad just jumped across the kitchen." And I shrugged and I said, "Hey, combat vet, kid. It's part of the ticket, right? I mean, this is part of the price of admission to what we did, and being able to, and at that point, I think this was several years ago, so 14, 15 years old, and he had, grown up with it and kind of seen that, but just to be able to say, I was able to regulate myself back to baseline, and like you said, was de-escalated very quickly, but that stuff is still going to happen. And if the family isn't aware of it and understand it, then they're not going to be able to manage it quite as well.
No, that's absolutely right. It's just education and a sense of humor. Those are two very simple things that I think would go 80% of the way toward avoiding these horrible divorces and a lot of drinking.
Right. Yeah. This has been great. Before we go, I really want to get in because I think we could talk for probably several hours.
We go all day here. I know.
But you got another book coming out, and as this show airs, it'll be out for about another month. Deep River, and I was looking into it. Not necessarily. It's not a combat story, but it has some kind of transitional undertones, appears to be what it's like to be from one culture and emerging into another. I'd like to hear a little bit about the upcoming book, Deep River.
Yeah, great. It's hardly any mention of war except that in the First World War. It's set in at the turn of the last century, and it's about it's a family saga about a woman and her brothers, and each of them has a different attitude toward life. We all carry attitudes toward life. Like she, because of her childhood and certain traumas that happened to her, becomes an ardent communist and a labor organizer, joins the IWW. Another brother just thinks that the way he's going to stave off, fear of death and anxiety is he's going to get rich. He wants his own logging company. And another one goes to traditional religion. And one of the people that she falls in love with just wants his own fishing boat. I mean, it's the individual versus the collective. And we for some reason, this culture can't understand that both are valuable. I mean, we need a conservative wing in our politics, and we need a liberal wing in our politics, because if everybody was a liberal, we would do a lot of stupid stuff. And if everybody was a conservative, nothing would change. And so we need both, but we can't seem as a culture to get that through our head. And so I got this novel of these Finnish immigrants. They're all from Finland, and they have to learn how to become Americans and move into American society and get along with each other. They're still a family that still loves each other, but boy, do they have different attitudes about how to handle the world. And they argue, but that doesn't destroy the bonds. That doesn't destroy the love that they have for each other. It makes it harder. So it's a novel. It's set in a logging camp, Southwest Washington, at the turn of the century. And it deals a lot with the environment. It deals a lot with there's a lot of sort of issues of religion and spirituality that I deal with. It's just my particular bent, and I'm hoping that it's a good book that people will enjoy reading it.
Yeah, I appreciate this idea where we're not just one-trick ponies, right? Veterans can leave the military and become authors or podcasters, and definitely like the other two books, Matterhorn and then What It Is Like to Go to War, being very similar. But that's not all you are, and that's not all you do. Just like, the infantrymen, that's not all they did. That you got more stories inside you, and they're not all about war. And I think even that is a good example for those who haven't fought to say, wait a minute, I thought you were the war guy.
Yeah, I know. I have joked with my family. I said, I'm the war guy. I mean, 3 Marines pee on a dead Taliban. I got 7 radio interviews about it. I mean, it's just like I was a war guy because of those books that came out. I'm very happy. They were successful books, and man, I'm never going to complain about that. But people love to put other people in categories. And, and the category I got put in was war guy. You just nailed it. And luckily, this book's going to be published. It has nothing to do with, war and combat.
Yeah. I have a buddy of mine who, is a Marine, as a matter of fact. And he went to his therapist, and his therapist said, well, I don't know if I can help you. She's like, I'm not he fought in Helmand and Fallujah. I think he did 2 tours. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, I don't think I can help you because I have no military background. And Jay said, I'm not coming to you as a veteran to talk about my war stuff. I'm coming to you as a human to talk about my human stuff.
Really, absolutely right. And again, I think just for therapists out there, that you are no less effective because you don't understand, quote unquote, what it's like to be in combat. Nobody understands what it's like to be in combat except the one guy who's talking to you. I mean, the people who've been there understand it, but that's very, very few people. And what they're looking for is someone to listen to them, someone who's safe to talk to, someone who reaches them as an individual. That has nothing to do with combat. I mean, what therapists give to everybody, but certainly to veterans, is that ability to just sort of unburden your soul, and then have somebody who doesn't have your particular, peccadillos and irrationalities point out paths to you that you might not have thought of, and or maybe your thinking's just a little confused on this issue, and that doesn't take any understanding of combat. And it goes 2 ways. I mean, combat veterans, and believe me, I'm one of them, have a kind of a disdain for people that haven't been there. Well, you don't know what the F I'm talking about. You have no idea. That's that sort of arrogance. Like, I've been there. I've seen the elephant. You haven't. And that gets in your way too. I mean, if you want to rejoin society, you got to get off of that high horse. Like I tell friends of mine who are that way, I said, listen, if all the women in the world didn't want to talk to the men because they don't understand childbirth. I said, we'd be in a real hum. Okay, we'll never understand childbirth. We can empathize. We can come close to it. We can read about it. We can, there's a lot of ways we can get more attuned to it, but we'll never get it. Just the same way as that people will never get combat. That's no reason for you to not talk to these people, really.
Yeah, that's great, and I really appreciate you taking the time today. If people wanted to pick up Deep River, as I'm certain that they will, or Matterhorn, or What It's Like to Go to War, or anything like that, how can people find the books, or maybe reach out to you or things online?
They're all, all the independent bookstores have Deep River and Matterhorn now. It's not Deep River. Matterhorn, What It's Like to Go to War, and Amazon carries it. Barnes and Noble carries it. You can order it online, and Deep River will be published July 2nd. But it's already in the pre-order state. So if you want to just pre-order it, you can just go online and pre-order it, or you can go again to your independent bookstore if you have one that you like, and just pre-order it, and it'll be there on July 2nd.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today, Karl.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Nice to talk to you, and great questions. Thank you.
You're listening to Headspace and Timing, where we're trying to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health. I'm appreciative of how generous Karl was with his time and insight. As I mentioned in the show, it's great to hear how outspoken he is about therapy and mental health counseling. It tells me that the conversation around mental health and wellness is starting to change. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you want to find the show notes for this episode, go to veteranmentalhealth.com/HST137. Just a reminder that the guests and information on this show are for educational purposes only and not meant to be considered professional advice. While I am a therapist, I am not your therapist. If something you heard makes you think that you should talk to somebody, then reach out to do so. If something you heard makes you think of somebody who you think could hear it, then please share it with them. I'd like to thank Doc Todd for giving us permission to use his track Not Alone from his album Combat Medicine. Doc's trying to bring the discussion about veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can see all of his work at therealdoctodd.com. Make sure to join us for the next episode. Hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice so you don't miss it. Until then, remember, veterans, you're not alone. Ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost their soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this planning. I heard each time I wait, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision Lasix, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this planning. I heard each time I wait, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain. Stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.